It's such an incredible honor to be a speaker in the lecture series named for Natalie Zemon Davis, whose influence and his importance and scholarship in so many ways have influenced generations of scholars. I am really deeply grateful to the Department of History and the Department of Medieval Studies and Professor Gabor Klanichai for having me here, and to all of you for joining us on this rainy day in Vienna, and to those of you who are with us on Zoom. Thank you for being here and for wanting to listen to me. So this lecture series is about material that I am familiar with, but I wanted to approach from slightly different way of retrieving Jewish lives from what I call the hostile archives, and we'll see in a moment what I mean by that. Human beings participate in history both as actors and as narrators, wrote Michel Rolf-Trouillot in his influential book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Trouillot drew attention to the issues of power in the telling and production of history and the resulting, as he put it, silencing of the past. He identified 4 crucial moments when silences are introduced: the moment of fact creation, the making of sources, the moment of fact assembly, that is the making of the archives, the moment of fact retrieval, that is the making of narratives, and the moment of retrospective significance, that is the making of history in the final instance. As he distinguished between the past, that is what happened in the past, and history, that is how that past has been told, he argued that the silencing of the past was, quote, due to an evil power in the production of sources, archives, and narratives. Although Trouillot devoted his work to exploring these issues through the lens of history of Haiti, some of the questions he raised also apply to other places and subjects. Historians of European colonialism have been recently decolonizing the archives in order to uncover subaltern voices by seeking to understand the workings of the archives, how the archives were created, what they included and what excluded, and as Catherine Burns put it, by, quote, devising strategies about how to read against the archival grain. In her work on colonial archives in Peru, Burns asked who had the power to make other people's deeds and desires legally true, what was silenced and what was made salient, and finally, whose truth was in the archives. So too, historians of medieval and early modern Europe pondered similar questions about peasants, women, and children, all of whom, as Natalie Zemon Davis has put it, have left us few documents of self-revelations. In her Return of Martin Guerre, published 13 years before Trouillot's Silencing of the Past, Natalie Zemon Davis tried to fill in the silences to uncover the emotional life and motivations of peasants in Artigas. To tell the story of lives of Bertrand, Martin, and Arnaud, she followed clues she found in the archives and in contemporary narratives, which had imploded this unusual story for 16th century audiences. And in her influential Fiction in the Archives, Natalie exploded the positivist myths of archival records as factual, accurate, and truthful, and drew our attention to the literary and fictive aspects of archival records. Some of the questions raised by these scholars are also pertinent to Jewish history. As a minority for most of their history, that is, a group living within a dominant majority culture, Jews were often marginalized, if not necessarily persecuted. Their lives were recorded in the archives of the dominant societies, but only when they're intersected with the concerns of those in power. Still, these sources are important because for much of the pre-modern Jewish history, crucial information about Jews' lives comes from non-Jewish archives. There are, of course, Jewish sources, rabbinic literature, liturgy and religious records, community records like the one on the slide, material culture, primarily liturgical objects, and in the landscape, synagogues and cemeteries. But in comparison to those found in non-Jewish archives, such sources are relatively scant, skewed toward learned elites, institutions, and religious ceremonies. Daily life often remains in faint traces only, although scholars of medieval Jewish history in particular have been teasing out those daily lives from those rabbinic records, as Alicia Baumgarten's group at Hebrew University. Moreover, unprotected by dominant institutions of power, both when they were created and in modern times, many original documents produced by Jews were lost during the calamities of the past, through fires and floods, and through as well as wars, and intentional destruction, or at least intentional disregard for their preservation. In fact, because in the pre-modern period, Jews were a separate legal estate, like other estates, including the nobles and the church, they were granted autonomy to adjudicate cases among themselves. And in some certain category of cases with Christians, court proceedings were held near or in synagogues, even when Christian royal or other officials were in attendance, and Jews were responsible for keeping and maintaining such records. For example, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in the Przemysl district of the Ruthenian Palatinate, the 1660 privilege outlining the legal status of Jews stated that, I think I have a slide. No, sorry. Jewish documents or cases with the record books should not be taken out of the synagogue, but should be kept in a chest with my seal and 2 locks, the key to one of which should be kept by the scribe and to the other by the beadle, by the shamus. And the deputy palatinate, a royal official charged with matters concerning Jews, should not himself hold any Jewish records or accept any registration or protests, declarations, or wound examinations or sequestrations. If any such were accepted by him, they shall be deemed invalid. Rather, the Jewish elders should have them inscribed and inserted in the record books kept in the synagogue. Similarly, in 1692, the privilege granted to the Jews of Lviv now, also required that, quote, all protocols past and present, as well as the record books and documents of the Palatine's court, should be kept locked in a chest and in a court chamber, which was located by the synagogue. But this meant that when modern states were consolidating their political and administrative structures and creating modern archives, the archives of those who, such as the Jewish communities, were at the time when these archives, the state archives were created, erroneously considered outside the state structures, were not included in the modern archival collections. From the 19th century, especially in Western Europe, Jews organized their own communal archives, centralizing them in a similar way as did modern states. The result was either the archival dispersion or subsequent loss, and most starkly, the removal of Jewish presence from city and regional official state archives across Europe. Jewish and non-Jewish histories became separate. Despite these pre-modern and modern archival practices, European state, municipal, and church archives nonetheless still possess records about Jews, as incomplete and fragmented as they are. And just as with Voices of the Peasants studied by Natalie Zemon Davis, Emmanuel Leroy-Redoury, and Carlo Ginzburg, and many other scholars, scholars of Jewish history and cultures have productively mined these reservoirs of evidence to recover glimpses of ordinary lives of Jews, even from archival records that document the unusual. To paraphrase Natalie Zemon Davis, much of historical evidence, after all, does not record peaceful times, but events that break with the norms. So, if we can retrieve vignettes of such subaltern lives, a question remains, can we recover ordinary lives from what I call hostile archives? From the evidence that was produced and collected explicitly to manufacture malicious tales and pass them as facts, and I put them in quotes. For Jewish history, in some places, these may be the only sources about Jewish lives that have survived. This is the case, for example, in Trento, now a town in northern Italy, which was from March 1475 until late spring 1476, a site of one of the most notorious and best documented blood libels in European history. And for that reason, scholars have studied these records, approaching them from different vantage points, probing different questions. The use of such records is not without pitfalls. They contain confessions and statements extracted under torture, many simply untrue. Historian Mario Spricoli, explaining why those subjected to interrogation under torture often offered incriminating confessions, noted that quote, circumstances of the facts, fragments of reality, provisional truths, fumes and odors, vacillations or trepidations were capable of indicating hypotheses to be cultivated or directions to be taken by interrogators. He argued that even clues have their eloquence. The unbearable pain afflicted through torture and was not the only means of extracting incriminating confessions. Mental manipulation was another, by using ideas or actions that were related to reality and real experience, and twisting the spirit of the accused. How then to sift through statements that may have been untrue and or distorted, and those that may offer glimpses into a lived reality? Which statements found in such hostile records merit acceptance and which demand to be rejected as inventions under torture or inventions of the inquisitors? How to examine the records without the danger of appearing to choose the information that fit our beliefs? Historian Diego Quaglioni cautioned against a naive reading of trial records that blurs, quote, the line between the word given and the word taken, la parola data e la parola presa, and between the words revealing facts that can be verified and the compulsion to say what the inquisitor wanted to be said at any cost. The role of the accused in the inquisitorial process was, as Mario Spricoli argued, to speak. And that of the prosecutor was to obtain a confession, not to conduct an investigation. There was no, as Quaglioni noted, the presumption of innocence. What comes down to us is refracted through text structured to prove Jews' guilt and testimony extorted under torture to reveal more about the presumptions and goals of the inquisitors than about the thoughts and experiences of those accused. When used naively to quote Quaglioni, or even recklessly, information extracted from such court records can misconstrue the past, leading to its dangerous abuses, as such as in the case of anti-Jewish libels, lending support to anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic accusations. But when used judiciously, such sources, despite their highly problematic nature, can still reveal glimpses of daily life with daily routines and interactions, religious rituals and practices, social attitudes, as well as connections between neighbors, Jews and Christians. And although all topics raised during the interrogations, even those indirectly related to the investigation, were ultimately meant to lead to achieving the prosecutorial goal to obtain a confession, clues scattered through the interrogations, and to quote a man of this city, Vienna, Sigmund Freud, the unconsidered or unnoticed details are what helps shed light of the life on the life of the trans Jews before the catastrophe of 1475. Trento, which you see on the map, a town in southern foothills of the Alps, was for centuries a liminal city within political borders of the Holy Roman Empire, but just a few miles away from the mighty Venetian Republic, straddling Italian and German cultures. In the 15th century, it began to attract German-speaking immigrants, Jews, and Christians. By the end of the 15th century, the German immigrants amounted to about 10% of the total population of 4,000 to 5,000 residents. Some of Trento's inhabitants, even its officials, like Johannes, who was the city captain in 1475, spoke only German, and some only Italian. Some occasionally spoke both. Jewish presence in Trento is documented since 1440, and in 1469, Samuel, son of Bonaventura from Nuremberg, received a privilege from the town's newly installed Prince Bishop Johannes Hinderbach, according to which he and his wife Brunetta were permitted to provide banking services in town. Evidence suggests that Samuel had arrived several years earlier. Trento's Jews lived integrated into the German part of town, next to a German-speaking tanners and shoemakers. Inhabiting no more than 3 houses, the community consisted of 3 families, headed by the above-mentioned Samuel, and here you have them actually named on the print from after the trial from 1475. Tobias, Tuvia, son of Jordan from Magdeburg, and Angel, son of Solomon of Verona, and their servants, as well as some visitors. It was probably no larger than 30 individuals, and the adult males could barely make a minyan. Samuel's house became the center of communal life. It also served as a synagogue and a mikvah, and more on that later. While Samuel engaged in banking, others made their living in various ways. Tobias, for instance, prepared medicine and was possibly a physician, although the sources provide contradictory evidence. Their wives took care of children and assisted in business, except for Tobias's young wife, Sarah, whom Tobias is considered too young to understand his métier. In March 1475, their lives were shattered. During the Christian Holy Week, overlapping that year with Jewish Passover, the Jews of Trento were accused of killing a toddler named Simon Unverdorben. Simon disappeared on Thursday, March 23rd, which was the second day of Passover. At first, people in town thought Simon had drowned in the town's many canals and ditches. But then rumors began to circulate that Jews may have killed the boy. Soon, their homes were searched, but nothing was found. On Easter Sunday, March 26th, Simon's body washed up under Samuel's house, and immediately Jews reported the findings. And here you have the 2 the two situations shown. To the authorities, who then apprehended the men and took them to the local prison while arresting women, placing women and children under house arrest. By late June 1475, the men would be dead. By late spring 1476, the women and children converted to Christianity. Jews would never live in Trento again. Simon's body was taken to a church nearby, which served the German community in town. And by Friday, March 31st, just 5 days of the boy's body being recovered, claims of miracles attributed to the boy were made, and a narrative vividly accusing Jews of killing Simon in hatred of Christ and turning Simon into a martyr of Jews was written by Giovanni Mattia Tiburino, the court physician of the Prince Bishop of Trento, Johannes Hinderbach, who had granted the privilege to Samuel a few years earlier. The boy's body now attained the status of a holy relic. Tiburino's narrative was printed on April 4th and then slightly revised, reprinted on April 17th. Already on March 31st, in a letter to poet Raffaele Sovenzoni, who would soon be hired to write poems about Simon's martyrdom, Bishop Hinderbach asserted that the new martyr was granted by God to the glory of the town, and invited the poet to come, see, and marvel this holy and venerable little body, which by the grace of God is still preserved in its entirety. The bishop then boasted the great number of pilgrims who daily come hither from every part of town. I think I have that, yes. From Italy and Germany, so many that the church of St. Peter, in which Simon's corpse is kept, cannot contain them, nor is the chapel where the tokens are kept big enough. The supposed miracles produced by Simon's relics and Tiburino's narrative that cast the boy as a martyr of Jews depended on each other. For Simon to be a holy martyr worthy of veneration by pilgrims, Jews had to be the killers. His death could not have been an accidental drowning, as the earlier testimony suggested. The officials were now deeply invested in condemning the Jews. This dynamic had been set before those arrested were fully interrogated. But this is not just the predetermined outcome of the trial, in which the officials had cast Jews as killers in order to promote Simon as a holy martyr, that make the surviving sources hostile. The bishop's own letters from the days immediately following Simon's death demonstrate his hostility towards them. In the same letter to Raffaele Sovenzoni from March 31st, Hinderbach described Jews as impious and villainous, and unequivocally guilty of killing Simon. Tiburino's account contains even more vile and evocative descriptive language, asserting the cruel Jews not only eat up Christians' properties in their frenzied craving for interest payments, but conspiring against our lives and for our destruction, they feast on the living blood of our sons, cruelly slaughtering them in place of Christ. They brutally, quote, slay a Christian infant in contempt of Lord Jesus Christ, and then devour his draught of blood in their unleavened loaves, and use Christian gore to keep themselves free of their powerful stench. Tiburino used animalistic and revolting vocabulary to describe Jews as howling, cruel, savage beasts devouring. To magnify the negative language and deepen its impact, he described Simon as kind, sweet, and innocent. The trial records progressively aligned with Tiburino's account, and by the end included similarly hostile language. The preserved protocols distort the accounts that would have been extracted even during the interrogations under torture, not only to make them align with the prerogative to prove Simon's martyrdom and thus Jews' guilt, but also through the different layers of language. The interrogations were conducted in languages that were not shared by anyone involved, in German, Italian, and Latin. The records were preserved in Latin and a German translation from Latin. Also, they also modify what was said during interrogations, or may have been said in the interrogations. Ultimately, there's no way to be sure what the Jews caught up in these trials actually said. But peering through the fog of distortion are details that document moments of Jews' everyday life, capturing histories of their families, their routines, and the last moments before their lives would be devastated. There were two main phases of the trial of Jews in the aftermath of Simon's death. One of the Jewish men that took place in 1475. It started, as I mentioned, soon after the boy's body was found, and ended in June with their execution. And the second one, the trial of women who had been under the house arrest since the men had been apprehended, and remained hopeful that the efforts of Jews and the papal envoy, Bishop Battista de Giudice of Ventimiglia, would result in their release. But their hopes were dashed in November 1475, when their trial began. The women's trial took place months after the tales, poems, images of Simon's supposed martyrdom had been disseminated across region and Europe, and months after their husbands and brothers had been executed. It ended in April 1476 with the women's confessions and their baptism celebrated in a performative public ceremony before Simon's venerated corpse. These different stages of prosecution served different purposes. The first one, the trial of men, served to prove that Simon was a martyr of Jews, to affirm the validity of Hinderbach's campaign to create a pilgrimage site. The interrogations thus focused on demonstrating the Jewish men's guilt through probing Jewish practices around Passover. All this was informed by the prosecutor's conviction that Jews murdered Christian children around that time. The trial of women, as Anna Esposito and Diego Quaglioni have argued, had the particular purpose of contributing to the cause of recognition of Simon's sanctity, and above all, it was a personal quest of Bishop Hinderbach to demonstrate to the world the correctness of his work. The women's convictions and conversions were thus iterative. Focused on the days preceding Passover, on our Passover rituals, the men's trial offered glimpses of daily life, neighborhood geography, household living arrangements, and cultural practices, including languages and religious observances. Women's records provide a look into Jewish life from women's perspective. There are added descriptions of house geography, sleeping arrangement, marital relations and practices, migrations, women's literacy, and women's religious practices. From remarks made during the trial, it emerges that some of the Jews may have arrived in Trento a decade or more before the calamitous events of 1475. Some arrived from Saxony, some from Bavaria, from Middle Franconia, and yet others from the Veneto. Samuel, the son of Bonaventura of Nuremberg, was the community leader. He purchased a house on an old market street, which was next to the house owned by a Christian man, Michael Rosa. Soon, Angelo and Tobias bought their own houses on the same street, but they were not all contiguous. While the men's trial reveals their family origin only through their names, women's records provide more details as the interrogations sought to map the relationship between the women and the men who had already been executed. For example, Sarah, only referred to as Tobias's wife in the men's protocols, said she was 13 when her father, one Abraham of Schwäbischer Werd, a town known since 1607 as Donauwörth, not far from Augsburg, married her off to one Elias from the city of Marburg. Sarah moved to Marburg to live with her new husband, but Elias died 6 years later. After waiting a year, Sarah, now a young widow, moved to Mestre, then a town in the territory of Treviso, now a mainland suburb of Venice. 4 years later, she married Tobias, a widower, so she was about 20 when she marries Tobias, and moved to Trento. The newlyweds had only a few months together, 3-4 months together, when Simon's death led to the utter collapse of their world. Another woman, Bella, perhaps a sister of Samuel's, grew up in Nuremberg with her father, Bonaventura or Seligman, and her mother, Gretel. At the age of 16, she was married off to Mohar. So we're learning about ages of these women marital practices, son of Moses, and moved with him to Halle in Saxony, where the couple shared a household with Mohar's father, Moses. After about 5 years, the family moved to another German town, which is referred to in the court records as Mulz, and I couldn't identify it, but I'm speculating that may have been Musen because it's of its proximity to Halle. And then around 1465, they arrived in Trento and moved in with Samuel. An example of how information about family history and mobility can emerge from hostile contexts is the testimony of Bona, the sister of Angelos, and a daughter of one Solomon of Verona. She was asked about, and that's how we learn about her peregrinations, when she first learned that Jews put blood into wine and matzah. Her answer, as it appears in the records, reveals that Bona was a divorcee. She had been living with her stepfather, Chaim, in Conegliano, and then moved to Mestre, so there's also the Mestre connection, where she married one Mazzio from Borgomanero. The couple then moved to Borgomanero and lived there for 7 years until Mazzio squandered the family fortune and abandoned her. 3 years later, he returned and took her back to her mother, Brunetta, in Conegliano, and after a few years, the two women moved to Trento to live with Angelo and his family. Samuel's house, which became the locus of Trento's Jewish community, it was turned later into a chapel, and that's what it looks like today. Which became the locus of Trento's Jewish community and had a room designated as a synagogue with a Torah scroll stored in what the records called Orno Kodesh, or a butchered version of Aron HaKodesh, as the Torah Ark was known among Ashkenazi Jews, located on the eastern wall. There was also a bima, or al-mamor, as Ashkenazi Jews called the stand on which the Torah was read. And the trial record described it as a round platform on which they placed their books, or a round platform on which they placed the 5 books of Moses. And in the protocols of Angelo, the meaning of Al-Mamor is explained as Hebrew for the place for sermons. The synagogue was a masculine space, with women removed to their own room. Vitale, the agent of Samuel and Brunetta, noted that this was a room in which, quote, Samuel's women used to sit. But that room was also used by other women. When asked how she participated in Sabbath rituals, Sarah, Tobias's wife, stated, quote, I did not enter the synagogue because women do not enter the synagogue, but I stayed in the chamber that is before the synagogue. According to Tobias's testimony, at least as recorded in the protocols, during the services, women remained, quote, in the chamber that is next to synagogue. They could not see anything unless they stood at the threshold. According to their custom, Tobias elaborated, women who found themselves in the chamber, which is before the synagogue, draw themselves to the door when the commandments of Moses are raised in the synagogue. The ritual of Hakbah, the lifting of the Torah, is based on a biblical verse from the book of Nehemiah. Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all people, for he was above all the people, and he opened it, all people stood up. The ritual was performed at the time of the Torah reading, which the Talmud prescribes for Mondays, Thursdays, and the Sabbath during the mincha, that is the afternoon prayers. Currently, the ritual takes place during the morning services, but the Trento Jews seem to have practiced the ritual, and it took me a lot of time to figure it out, I'm still not sure, late on the Sabbath. And Sarah specified it as around 22 hours. And the German version, the German translation, says it was around 5 o'clock. So maybe you'll help me figure out what time it was, because it doesn't seem to align. Suggesting that indeed they read the Torah not in the morning, but during the Mincha Ktana in the afternoon. The Hakbah was the only time women were allowed, was not the only time women were allowed to peer inside the men's synagogue from the threshold. They did so also during other festivities, such as the circumcision ceremonies. Bella mentioned the circumcision of Tobias's 3 sons and Angel's two sons, some 10 years prior. Answering the interrogator's leading questions, who wanted to prove that Jews use Christian blood in different rituals and ceremonies, including circumcisions, Bella reportedly said that she could not see what the circumciser, one Master Joseph from Riva di Trento, suggesting that this circumciser was coming from afar, did, because the boys were circumcised in the synagogue, quote, where there were many Jews, while Bella and other women were standing at the threshold of the synagogue, peering inside. This was a German custom. Women handed over the baby to Baal Brit and remained outside. Italian Jews accepted women's presence inside synagogues for the circumcision ceremonies. The Trent trial records provide an almost proto-ethnographic perspective on Jewish life and practices. Biased and distorted as they surely are, as they were intended to demonstrate Jews' guilt and therefore to prove Simon's martyrdom. Though not explicitly stated, but because Simon's body was retrieved from the water flowing under Samuel's house. Oh, here is the circumcision ceremony. I'm sorry, I missed the slide. Here's the retrieval again of the body. The interrogators wanted to know who went to the cellar and the canal and when. This is how we learn not only that Jews fetched water for cooking from the canal, even though sometimes debris and refuse would flow, but also that women used it for ritual immersion. Indeed, it appears that there was no formal mikveh, ritual bath, in Samuel's house. The community was likely too small for the tremendous expenditure, and here we have examples of the mikvaot in Speyer and Worms. Sarah, who married Tobias about 3 months before Simon's death, recounted going to immerse herself after her menstruation 3 or 4 times since she had married Tobias, including 2 or 3 days before Passover, when Tobias was in Bolzano. And then on Passover, when she went down to the subterranean, this is I'm quoting, went down to the subterranean place through which the canal passes, in which canal Sarah herself washed herself. More details about Sarah's immersion emerged from Samuel's and Tobias's testimonies. According to Samuel, Sarah, quote, went to the cellar and washed herself in the canal there because she, quote, had suffered menstruation in the previous days and it is the custom of the Jews and the Jewish women to wash themselves after their periods. Sarah was accompanied by Brunetta, Samuel's wife, and Anna, the wife of one Berthold Teutonicus. On this surface, it appears that Sarah was observing the rituals commonly practiced by Ashkenazi Jewish women, almost to the letter of the ideal expressed by Eleazar of Worms in his ethical will, a medieval rabbi, in which he extolled his daughters to, quote, obey scrupulously the rules applying to women, modesty, sanctity, and reverence, and they were to be punctuous and careful with their ritual bathing, taking with them women friends of worthy character. We do not know if Eleazar's text would have been known to anybody in Trento's Jewish community, or if its values were transmitted to these communities who then whose members then came to Trento. But Sarah was indeed punctuous and careful with her ritual bathing and took with her two women, Brunetta and Anna, to accompany her during her immersion. The only point of difference is that one of the women, Anna, was a Christian, a wife or a local laborer. This detail, of course, could have been consciously added by the men as part of the exculpating evidence, demonstrating that a Christian woman was not only in Samuel's house when Samuel was supposedly tortured or already killed, but she even went down to the very place where his body would have later been found. Still, exculpatory as it might have been, it was a detail that could have been easily verified, and indeed likely was, by the inquisitors. Tobias's earlier testimony from April 7 does not name Anna, referring to her only as, quote, another woman, a wife of a certain Christian whose name he did not know. Her name was added in his interrogation of April 19th and to Samuel's on June 7th. Anna's presence also seems to suggest variations of Jewish observance of rituals and perhaps close relations between her and the Jewish women. It does not appear that she was a servant, since servants were mentioned in the protocol in quite explicitly in other contexts, and many of them were in fact Jewish men, not Christian women, as it was common in Europe. There is much more I could be telling you about daily life of Jews in Trento, the preparation of meals, leisure activities on Shabbat and Jewish holidays, comings and goings in the three households, sleeping arrangements, house geographies, and much more. Alas, I do not have time, but as I'm wrapping up, I wanted to add one more comment. The nature of these trial records also means that much of what was not only distorted, but also concealed. The information preserved is only what would have been deemed useful from the perspective of the prosecutors to the case. For example, in the trial of men, no children are mentioned at all. There would have been children, some as young as 6, but perhaps even younger. And this is a consequential detail because a report about hearing the sound of a crying child was used as an evidence against Jews to prove that Simon must have been in their house. The discussion of other children might have raised doubts about treating a child's cry as evidence of Jews' culpability. Moreover, since children are perceptive, the presence and cry of another child might have elicited a reaction. But nothing is mentioned in the records. We learned about the children only in the context of women telling us about their lives, their pregnancies, and other family practices, and from the correspondence of the papal envoy, Bishop Battista de Giudici, who was seeking to release, quote, women and children from the house arrest. And so, if the Trent records offer a glimpse into some of the Jewish practices, showing the interrogators probing into Jewish rituals, ceremonies, and family life, The trial records from the Polish town of Sandomierz, a site of two blood libels in 1698 and 1710, reveal more about daily life and mobility, like daily mobility, and less about religious practices and beliefs, but more on this tomorrow. Thank you.